Did you know that every time we wash our clothes, thousands of microscopic fiber get shed into the environment? Microfibers are tiny threads that shed from both natural and synthetic fabrics. They can shed from clothing, carpets, and other materials made with or covered with textiles. Emerging research has shown that a large amount of microfibers found in the environment and in our waters were released from clothing. Today, I am joined by Lisa Erdle to discuss the impact of microfiber and some solutions to the problem.
Welcome to the Sustainability Nugget podcast. I am Rarasu Maraibi.
And I'm Tosin Folorunsho.
On this podcast, we learn about sustainability by discussing various related topics while focusing on three pillars: the economy, the society, and the environment.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today I'm with Lisa Erdle. She's an ecotoxicologist, microplastics and microfibers researcher, and she's currently the Director of Science and Innovations at Five Gyres. So Lisa and I actually met last year. Yes, it was last year. We met at so I attended an event hosted by Five Gyres on World Water Day. It was at this beautiful house in Santa Monica, California. And it brought together people in the fashion world, in sustainable fashion especially. So you had designers, we had people doing research, and we also had this nice little runway show in between. But it was nice to connect with other people who were working in the fashion space. And that's how I actually got to meet Lisa, who is a microfiber and microplastics researcher. And then at another occasion, we met in San Francisco at another event at a rooftop where they were actually doing a launch. Was it a pre-launch of the of Five Gyres trip?
Yeah, it was right before we set sail for San Francisco Bay to do research on microfiber transport. And fun, really fun event just before we set sail the next day.
Yes. Okay, so Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience today?
Yeah, that was a great intro. Thanks. And it's fun to think about all the different places we've gotten to cross paths over the years and meeting people in the sustainable fashion world. I've been a microplastics researcher for over a decade, but as the science has become more and more clear and we're going down to investigating these small particles, what really comes out as some of the most common particles, whether we look at fish or sediment or air, are these microfibers from textiles. So a lot of my research has been to understand where they're coming from, how do they end up in the environment, and then what are their effects to wildlife. I focused my grad school work looking at microfibers, looking at synthetics and naturals, both with and without chemicals, to really understand what their effects are. And there's still lots of research questions. As you know, the textile world is really complex. There's so many different chemicals. There's lots of different materials. And so we're just scratching at the surface and understanding effects, but we do know enough to act. And a lot of my work at Five Gyres has been focused on what are the solutions to prevent these harmful particles from getting in the environment in the first place. So we were doing both research and policy work on filtration to keep these microfibers from our clothing from entering the environment.
Awesome. Can you, so you mentioned how you pivoted from microplastics to microfiber. Can you tell us more about the research and what your findings were that made you, realize that microfiber might actually be a bigger problem than the microplastics problem?
Yeah. When the microplastics research started, the way that we looked at microplastics in the environment was to drag a net, something called a manta net. It kind of looks like a manta ray, floats on the surface of the ocean. We would drag these nets behind boats, and they were really great at helping us figure out how much microplastic is out in the marine environment. One downside of this, after sailing around the world and quantifying microplastics in surface water, is that the mesh size was 300 microns in size. So when we're talking about micrometers that were smaller than a millimeter, 300 microns is a third of a millimeter in size. So very, very fine mesh net. But as many folks who are in the fashion world know, So our fibers for our clothing are typically 10 to 20 microns in its smallest dimension. So these mesh sizes that are 300 microns, these fibers can pass through. They sometimes get caught up in these nets, especially as there's small particles and, getting piled up, and the more full the net is, the more likely they are to catch these small fibers, but still they can pass through. And it was only when we started looking at bulk samples of sediment or soil or water, where microplastics researchers started to quantify these smaller microfibers, where we look, whether it's, stormwater or in the guts of a fish, or in sediment or in soil, where we are looking at these smaller particles, we're finding microfibers are really common. And when we don't have destructive sampling methods, and we can count these natural fibers, we also see that natural fibers are common too, which isn't a huge surprise when you think about environments where things just don't break down very quickly, whether it's sediment or deep in soil layers. And these natural fibers, whether they're cellulosic, we see these anthropogenic fibers in the environment. So we did a study a few years ago now, 5 gyres, the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and the University of Toronto, looking at San Francisco Bay. We sampled stormwater, surface water, subsurface water, sediment, fish. It was the master's work of Alice Zhu at the University of Toronto. She did an incredible job looking at all these different environmental compartments. And what came out is some of the most common particles were these fibers. And a lot of them, sometimes over half, were anthropogenic natural fibers. So dyed, so they were cellulose, but they had blue dye or red dye and were clearly modified in some way. Not all microplastics researchers are looking for these natural fibers and can use chemicals like peroxides that would break down these natural fibers. But where we look, we see these natural fibers are really common. They obviously don't last as long in the environment as synthetics, but they can stick around a long time and contain harmful chemicals and dyes.
So you mentioned that most of the fibers found were natural fibers. Have you had any experience with polyester or synthetic fibers as well?
They're also very common, and they'll last in the environment much longer. These synthetic fibers are plastic, and we know that plastic is persistent in the environment. It does eventually break up into smaller pieces. They'll photodegrade, or mechanically they'll start to fragment some more and get into smaller and smaller pieces, but they never really go away. These natural fibers, and also the semi-synthetic ones, so thinking like regenerated cellulose, rayon, tensile, those sorts of fibers, they can break down, and there's research that shows how quickly they break down. But when they're modified with various finishes, dyes, these sorts of treatments can prolong their persistence in the environment, so they stick around much longer. Some cotton fibers can be a third synthetic chemicals by weight, and these synthetic chemicals, these dyes, these finishes that give waterproofness or stain resistance, flame retardants that are applied, they can really change how long these fibers persist in the environment, and what their ultimate effects are. The clothing that we wear has so many chemicals that are added in manufacturing, or even just they can act as these passive samplers and absorb chemicals from the environment. And we know that when we wash them, or when fibers shed from our clothing in normal wear, these fibers can contain those chemicals, and it's a way that chemicals get into the environment. So it's a plastics thing and a persistence thing, but even these natural fibers, they start to become a little bit more like plastic when they have a lot of synthetic chemicals in it.
So even though they're biodegradable, they're natural and biodegradable, but all of the chemicals that have been added to them have changed their ability to biodegrade easily, and the chemicals also could impact the environment. I guess I'll let you talk more about what you found to be the impact on the environment and on humans and animals of finding these natural fibers in the environment.
Yeah, these natural fibers can have negative effects too. We've known for many years that microplastics can have negative impacts on the environment. Both they can change feeding behavior, and they can damage digestive tracts. There are these physical effects. They can have these chemical effects too, where they are transferring, carcinogenic or endocrine disrupting chemicals, and those can have negative effects. And it makes sense that, polyester and nylon fibers, they can have these similar negative effects to other microplastics. But what's relatively newer is that these natural fibers can also have effects. They can have these physical effects where they can accumulate in digestive tracts. They can damage the gut. They can also transfer chemicals. Many chemicals that are used in textiles are lipophilic, and they could transfer from these fibers into the tissues of animals that are eating them. So with textiles and microfibers, both the synthetics and the naturals, you've got a very unique chemical cocktail of things like dyes and finishes that are used in manufacturing that can cause these negative effects. But it's complex. There's a lot of chemicals that are out there, and it can be really challenging as a scientist to design these experiments that are realistic and are representative of the chemicals that are used in manufacturing. Because sometimes we just don't know what chemicals are going into things. So we can take textiles and then see what happens to animals in the lab when they are exposed. But with this complex mixture, it can be hard to go upstream and trace what was put into it and figure out the solutions to prevent harm. But we're learning more and more, and the list of chemicals is growing. But I think there's a greater awareness and understanding of how some of these chemicals are causing harm.
Yeah, I'm currently reading a book by Alden Wicker. It's called To Die For, DYE, and it's just talking about the toxic chemicals in our clothing, and just to find out that there are thousands of chemicals for us that are added to like our clothing, our cosmetics, even food. It's surprising that, and then it takes time to do research on just finding one chemical component, and then it becomes more, should I say, potent or hazardous when you're combining all of this, like all of the chemicals together. And there could be like 4 to 5 or 6 chemicals in one clothing, which they could be in trace amounts, right, in their singular form, but then when they're combined together into compounds, it becomes becomes more dangerous to our skin or to our body when we wear the clothing or when we ingest them.
Yeah, and we don't know a lot, and there's new research on this that's really exciting that's coming out and in predicting how chemicals interact with each other. So you can have chemicals that are the negative effects are additive. So 1 + 1 = 2, but you could also have 1 + 1 = 7, or 1 + 1 = 1. And we're trying to understand how these chemicals interact with each other. But we're just starting to scratch the surface. For plastics in general, this isn't for textiles, but plastics more broadly speaking, there are hundreds of polymers. A recent report by Plaschem came out just recently that identified over 16,000 chemicals associated with plastics. We only have good toxicity data for less than 100. So we have a lot of chemicals that are out there, and we really don't know a lot about what they do in the environment. And unfortunately, since the rise of plastics and synthetic chemicals, our approach has been that these chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. And not the other way around, where we take a precautionary approach. In some parts of the world do this, like in Europe, and they're really careful about introducing new chemicals and needing to show that there isn't harm. But it becomes a game of whack-a-mole. We've seen that with perfluorinated chemicals like PFAS in the United States here, where you can have a ban on one and then a new chemical comes up, and then over time we'd find out too that chemical also causes harm, but it's then too late because it's been used and emitted into the environment for decades until you build up enough of a case to show its harm. So I think we really need to take a more careful, more intentional approach to chemical use.
That's right. Yeah. It's sad that we're unable to, it's like it's until things have really gotten bad or there's, substantial evidence. We could take, as you said, decades, and people could have, died or had to treat very serious illnesses because they didn't realize it was linked to the chemicals. And then it takes years, and just finding that evidence, or finding people who are also willing to talk about it, for example, even know that was the problem, will take a long while to figure out. And until then, as you said, the chemicals are just innocent. There should be, I think it's interesting in not only the US, I would say. I feel, parts of Europe, there are precautionary, at least they're more precautionary about things like that. But, in other parts of the world, or developing countries, or middle and rising income countries, where a lot of production is happening and there are lax regulations about chemicals, it's also easy to just get away with things like that.
Sometimes the fines aren't high enough for a company to really have an incentive to not produce it, or to ensure it's not in there. With the fashion world, you've got really long supply chains, and you do have chemical management and regulation, but we can sometimes only regulate where we have the data, and there's a lot of data gaps.
Right. So I want you to talk about what Five Gyres is doing. So you're doing research and you're finding out these things, but what are you doing to create awareness, or what solutions are you have you been implementing? We just went this year, actually 2 weeks ago, at another conference hosted by Five Gyres. It's called the Microfiber Symposium. And I know, I've learned of some of the things that Five Gyres are doing, but I want you to tell our audience what are those solutions.
Yeah, because we see that there are these microfibers in the environment. We know that they're coming from textiles and things like our clothing, also in indoor environments, carpeting and upholstery. So it's not just clothes, but we know that these fibers are in the environment, and we need solutions just to prevent them. We're still asking lots of questions about toxicity mixtures and different materials and relative effects of different types of microfibers, but we do know enough to act. We know that there's a long list of harm from growth and feeding behavior, can cause mortality, can cause these chemical effects in large livers. We know enough, and we want to try to find solutions to prevent these microfibers from going into the environment in the first place. So we've been doing research on capture devices with the University of Toronto, did research on the effectiveness of different filters on washing machines. We tested in the lab and then on the scale of a small community. And these filters that are attached onto your washing machine, they can capture up to 90% of microfibers in every single load of laundry, kind of like the lint trap in your dryer. You clean it out, and it goes into the waste bin, and eventually into where we live, a closed landfill, better than it going directly into the environment. But the next logical step would be just to have these sorts of filters built into washing machines. So Five Gyres has been working on policy in California that would require new washing machines to contain these filters, and other parts of the world are doing similar laws where new washing machines would have to have these filters automatically built in, which is kind of a logical next step. And we're doing research into dryers. We know that washing machines is a source of fibers to the environment. We see fibers in sewage treatment plants, and some of these fibers are going directly into the environment. But there's also lots of fibers that are in the air, in city air. Really common also in indoor environments. Many people are probably aware of being indoors and seeing dust flying around, and these brightly colored flecks of dust that are either in the air or settling out on a surface if you take a cloth and wipe a counter or a window ledge. If we really look at it, you can often see these brightly colored flecks, these fibers. So they're in our air, and fibers are in our lungs. So we're trying to think of ways to reduce the contamination in the environment and contamination to us, we're just starting to uncover what the human health effects are. Researchers are finding that fibers are some of the most common particles in lungs. They're also some of the most common microplastics in placentas. And as more human health research is coming out, we're seeing that these fibers are in us, and they can cause these physical and chemical effects. And so research is now asking, if you have a fiber in the lungs, what does it do? There's some evidence that shows it's related to tumor formation in lungs, but we're still at the very early stages of figuring out what the health effects are in its chemical effects too. But we've known for many decades that, even over 100 years, that these fibers, including natural ones, can cause respiratory diseases. People who worked in textile mills and cotton mills were more prone to tuberculosis and other lung diseases. So at high concentrations, these fibers can have these negative effects and lead to higher mortality in people. At lower doses, we're still not sure, but with the exposure and the chemicals, I think there's enough to have cause for concern and find solutions to prevent or overall exposure. So we're trying to understand where these fibers are coming from and what the solutions are to prevent them from getting in the environment in the first place.
Cool. So in terms of you talked about the filter. So does it go in the machine currently?
There's different ones. So we in the lab we tested both a device that goes directly into the machine and then a filter that is installed externally. And the one that's installed externally, that's the one that's quite effective. It has a 100 micron mesh and can filter out the fibers in each load of laundry. So after the load, the water filters through this mesh, and then the user empties it out and cleans it. There's now lots of innovation that's working on filtration devices that are built directly into the machine, so it's not something external that you need to pay a plumber to install and need to buy. But it would make a lot more sense just to have it automatically built in, and ultimately cheaper for people to have them installed in the production of washing machines. And lots of really exciting innovation in that space. So either using filters, or I've seen types of devices that are mimicking whale balines and using centrifugal forces to sort of capture those fibers. So there's lots of really exciting innovation in the space, and as you're removing these fibers, you're also potentially removing the chemicals too.
That's really nice to know that there's solutions. So speaking of solutions, so you're talking about washing machines. For me, I'm thinking about people who don't use or don't have access, for example. So we're talking about inclusive solutions. Like, I grew up in Nigeria, and in some parts of Africa where we might not have access to like technologies like that. Are there solutions for hand washing, or should I say that does hand washing shed as much microfiber as machine washing?
The research that I've seen is that hand washing does not shed as much. There's a paper that came out that found that hand washing had 10 times less microfiber shedding compared to a washing machine. Washing and drying our clothes in washers and dryers is really hard on our clothing. There's a lot of breakage of the fibers. Although this was hand washing in a plastic basin and slightly more delicate. And as you probably know, the methods that people use for hand washing can vary a lot around the world. So I'd be really interested to know how hand washing, affects different types of hand washing affects the shedding rate, and how the material types shed. We know that natural fibers tend to shed more than synthetics when they're staple microfibers. So like cotton blue jeans can shed a lot more than filament fiber for synthetics even. So the shedding rates can be quite high for natural fibers, but in many cases these methods of producing textiles and laundering them evolved together, and there's a lot of energy that goes into producing materials. And for so long, we had these incentives to really protect and care for the things that we wore. And now in many parts of the world, we have a very disposable approach to our clothing, where fashion seasons change so quickly. So you don't need to have clothing that will last many years, because maybe by next
You're
year
constantly changing them.
the
Yeah.
fashion changed anyway. So what you wear is donated and maybe resold, but most likely will end up in
landfill.
landfill. Clothing is the second most discarded type of plastic after single-use packaging. There's a lot that's ending up in landfill. So I think there's a few things really that it's great that hand washing sheds fewer microfibers. I don't know if we're ever going to get people who have washing machines to hand wash, but I think we could be more careful and more gentle.
Maybe not.
In general.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the research that I've seen shows that hand washing sheds fewer microfibers. But I'd be curious, especially in places where there's a lot of synthetics and hand washing and release directly into the environment. Is there an opportunity to filter that water so it's not contaminating fishing grounds or drinking water sources? And the filters that we have for washing machines that are now built in, they really came from simple solutions less than a decade ago, where engineers would take nylon stockings and put it on a pipe before it's draining into a sink. And Blair Jollymore, an innovator in Halifax, Canada, said, "Oh, can I make a filter that's filtering out this water, and I don't need to put my wife's old pantyhose on this effluent pipe, and I can make something that can filter out these fibers." And it works. It's really effective. We tested it. So that's really some of the innovation that spurred this type of work to find solutions for washing machines. But some of these solutions can be really cost effective and low tech, and can be applied in other parts of the world. And as we're discovering how persistent these fibers are and their negative effects, it might be something to consider, offering these solutions to capture fibers so it doesn't pollute local environments.
Cool. So there were two things you said that got my attention. The first one was when you had mentioned like the different hand washing methods, and I was thinking about and just how they're released into the environment. Like there are people who I was used to, before we got a washing machine in our house, for example, I was used to like washing in a large bowl, and then just pour it into like our if I was washing outside, for example, I'm going into specific details here, I would pour the water out on the soil, and it would drain into the soil. But there are people who would go to the river to wash their clothing, and I've still seen videos of things like that happen in some parts of Africa, like even in India, for example. So it's like that's whatever is shedding, even if it's lesser, it's shedding directly into the environment. Right. And so it's like, I don't know what the solution could be to that, but just, that was just a thought, that picture that came to my mind when you were talking. And then another thing you mentioned was that the second was discarded plastic after single-use plastic is clothing. I think most people still do not connect the fact that some of our clothing, especially if you hear polyester, spandex, elastane, it's made from the same material, the same products used to make plastic. And so when you tell some people that plastic clothing is actually plastic, they're like, really?
Not plastic. Nylon.
Yeah, right. So I think it's just also just specifying what our polyester is plastic, basically. So if you're wearing, and most of what we wear today, about 70% of the clothing that we actually is produced today is made from plastic or is polyester. But then even natural fiber, just differentiating. Natural fiber can be cotton, can be wool, it can be linen, right? So just making that clarification for people to understand. Yes, clothing can be plastic.
Yeah, and now the share of plastic in our clothing has surpassed the natural fibers in terms of global production. And we, we couldn't keep up with our appetite for consumption with only natural fibers. It would take so much land. But there's a lot that's out there, and a lot that gets worn very little and eventually goes to landfill. We've got relatively short lifespans of our clothing, where we used to keep things for much longer. And it's still possible to have timeless pieces and things that you can keep re-wearing. And I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of our behavior and how we buy and wear and use clothing. But yeah, I'm also so curious about these different hand washing techniques and what that means for emissions into the environment. Is there a lot? Is there a little? I think from the research side, we still don't know. And depending on how things are washed, if things are washed in a basin and then poured out, that's a good opportunity for filtration. If things are washed directly riverside or on stones and you're kind of rinsing off those areas where you're trying to wash, that could be a lot harder to capture. But I'd love to see more people asking these sort of questions and working in this space to understand what the emissions are and then what the effects are for these communities. We see that in soil. There are synthetic fibers that are in agricultural areas, for other researchers used to use synthetic fibers as a marker in the soil. So before we started looking at microplastics and started that research, dating back to the 1970s, researchers were looking at agricultural fields, looking for synthetic fibers. And where they found synthetic fibers, they could tell that biosolids, the solids that come from sewage treatment plants that are applied as a fertilizer on land, they could tell that those biosolids had been applied. And these were researchers who were looking for heavy metals and pharmaceuticals in soil, because we know that plants can take up these compounds. And if food is grown in it, you can have even things like antidepressants that are taken up by plants, and they can be in food plants, then can show up in the blood of people who are eating those plants. So researchers for a long time were using synthetic fibers as markers just to know, was there sewage sludge applied here? Because the fibers often get captured in sludge. Most of them get captured in sludge. So we've known for a long time that they can persist in the environment. It's only relatively recently that we've started to look for them and thinking about what their effects are for soil organisms, for us, for wildlife.
That's very interesting. So I'm thinking about how, apart from filtering solutions, the act of washing itself, like I'm thinking so in other conversations about fashion and just like the problem with fast fashion, or the problem with just overconsumption of fashion products, we often talk about reducing how much we buy. And also, like, some actions you can take to help your clothes last longer is to wash less. So I'm thinking if washing less could apply to, shedding less, especially since I think you mentioned that natural fibers actually tend to shed more than polyester. Yeah. So in the case where you're washing your clothing less, does that help?
Yeah, washing clothing less does help. And we have a guide that you can find on 5Jars' website, a do less guide that gives some recommendations on how often you should wash different items of clothing. Even denim companies like Levi Strauss have come out and said, you should rarely wash these, if at all. And there's other things you can do to either to air out and hang dry, or some fibers you can put in the freezer to reduce odor. There's a lot of other things other than just checking it mindlessly in the wash that can prolong the life of the garment and the look and the feel. Denim, many of us have denim in our closets, and it can take on these natural wear patterns and shapes that can get destroyed when you put it in the washer and the dryer.
Right.
So yeah, we have a guide on how often should wash things. The sniff test is a great one. you don't have to wash every single thing after one
Right.
wear.
Yeah.
And there's these other benefits too, beyond microfiber shedding, energy use and water use. And we, I think, have been brainwashed to overwash, and it's not always necessary. Not everyone needs to be a smelly hippie, but
Right.
we really over launder our clothing, and there's tons of really interesting innovations that I'd like to see more of. There's green dry cleaning and
Right.
cleaning with CO2 and lots of other different ways that we might move away from just our traditional
Regular washing.
home washing machines, or
Yeah.
maybe even doing more hand washing, especially for synthetics that high heat and high abrasion can start to break apart the
Right.
elastane and other synthetic fibers. Some constructions of textiles for synthetics can shed a lot, especially if these fleece that have been brushed and have lots of fiber exposure, or unfinished edges that haven't been hemmed or haven't been constructed well. Probably many folks are aware of looking at fast fashion items that just look like the stitching was slapped on, and there's tons of loose fibers, and we know from research that in the first washes there's a lot of shedding, and a lot of shedding for poorly constructed garments. So maybe even there's a regulation on how garments are constructed, and a threshold that garments can't shed over a certain amount to really reduce the microfiber pollution that we have coming off our clothing when we wear them, and then when we wash them. But there's a lot of things that people can do in terms of washing, cooler temperatures. There's not a lot of effect in detergent type, but we know that front loaders shed fewer fibers than top loaders, and just in general, washing less and buying used where possible, because used clothing typically sheds less.
Washed a lot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think we need to do an episode on this podcast. I'm thinking about an episode on just like your clothing care, because I think a lot of times there's a misconception that not washing your clothes often makes you feel ippy, which it's a practice I've learned to. It's one of the things I started doing, apart from not buying less, which is also like this. Okay, now I'm buying less clothing, but what am I doing to ensure the clothing that I'm using lasts longer? If their quality is questionable, with fast fashion, I do have fast fashion items, in my wardrobe. I can't deny that, but it's like, even with those pieces, how do I actually keep them longer? So things like, using your machine wash code. Always use cold water to wash. And also for me, sometimes I just keep drying totally, especially with polyester. Most of my polyester fabrics I just keep drying, and so I have like a dryer, the regular clothing dryer,
like air drying,
the hanger one, to hair dry. So that, and I see that's very helpful to just keep them, still be able to use them for a long time. So
most of the world air dries clothes. It's a very North American practice to use a dryer.
Okay, so you at multiple occasions you talked about policies and regulations. How do you think this can actually facilitate long-term system-wide reduction in the microfiber pollution?
Yeah, I think so. Especially now, it's a solution that we know is effective and exists. It's not perfect to filter out fibers from our washers and dryers as a point of capture, because our clothing also just sheds to the air. But it is a solution that we know works and could reduce the amount of fibers that are going to wastewater treatment plants and then entering into aquatic environments through the water and terrestrial environments through the soil. So it's a solution that we know works and could, filters were installed in every washing machine in the city like Los Angeles or San Francisco, it would be many trillions of microfibers captured every year and preventing them from going into the environment. So we're talking about really big numbers and potentially significant effects. But it's not the only solution. We need upstream innovations. We need textiles that shed less. There can be many hundreds of times difference in terms of shedding rate for textiles that shed a lot and textiles that shed very little. So the high shedders, maybe they're banned or they're phased out voluntarily by clothing companies and other textile manufacturers. But there's a big range in how many microfibers are shed that we already know of. And we know some of the textile constructions that lead to really high shedding, like I mentioned before. And I don't know if that's going to be regulated, but there's definitely room for a lot of upstream innovation and design that's not just capturing at the level of the washing machine and the dryer, and could have these other benefits. If you have textiles that are shedding less in the wash, they're also likely shedding less when you're wearing them. So it's less microfibers that are going to the air.
So yes, considering upstream solutions, especially for, well, I would say policies or regulations for design and innovation, with the complexity of the fashion supply chain, I wonder if that's something that would be feasible enough, especially when if you have a long supply chain where you are most likely not directly connected as a fashion brand. Now you're not directly connected to like the manufacturer of your clothing. And even if the policies are passed here in North America, for example, what's the likelihood that it would actually have an effect in other countries where they're being produced? Like, so for example, most of the clothing we produce are in Asia, right? So it's like if you're in countries like Bangladesh or Indonesia where the policies are just not the same, I don't see. I'm just wondering how that would translate into being effective eventually. Like if you're talking about construction, it's like, well, and would it be placing more burden on those people who are also, short on time for production, and also just even the pay they're getting? It's like they're one of the reasons why clothing is produced in those places, because it's cheaper to produce. So it's like, how do you how do you do this without adding on more, should I say, responsibility on them, or just at least making it easier for them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that's pretty complex and will require really thoughtful solutions. But one thing that I think of is if you are producing materials that shed less, they're sometimes more durable and will last longer, and potentially, and this is just hypothetical, we don't know this, but maybe it's shedding fewer microfibers when those garments are being constructed. And we know that these there is a real occupational health hazard for people who are in these production facilities. So if the brands are demanding materials that shed fewer microfibers, it would be possible that they shed fewer fibers in the production facilities. What you don't want to see is these negative impacts that are then burdening these poorer countries and these countries where in the global south where a lot of the production happens, or a dumping of textiles because they don't meet a certain threshold by an American brand. So if a brand says it can't shed more than 1,000 microfibers in for this one size textile and this one load of laundry, and if it doesn't meet that level, what happens with that material? Does it go to landfill? That doesn't seem like it's a great solution. Does it then go to communities locally, and are they then more exposed to microfibers than the textiles that then get shipped to the US and Canada and Europe? I don't think that's a great solution either. So we do, as there are policies that get implemented, whether it's regulatory or whether it's policies that in a company and setting their own standards, we have to think really holistically about the fashion supply chain. If we're implementing a pre-wash and capturing the fiber shedding in the first wash, what happens with that sludge? Does it get disposed of in a safe way, or is it potentially exposing local communities? And we really need to focus on the health of communities where the production happens. It's for too long been out of sight and out of mind, but it needs to be a lot more central in our thinking.
Yeah, it's very true. Those are the things I think about with policy a lot. In one of the things I'm doing my research is policy evaluations, and sometimes I see that policies are, they're great, and they're definitely right step, a step in the right direction, but also just thinking about how the whole of the stakeholders, which it affecting, and then implementation or just long-term effects, like who exactly would this would bear the responsibility for this. It's really important to think about these things when designing policies.
Yeah. And that's where I think bringing together scientists, researchers like you, bringing together brands, and sharing all of these learnings and questions, and running a pilot on and seeing really what's happening, because you don't want there to be these unforeseen consequences, these negative impacts, these regrettable policies that have another negative impact. But I think it can be avoided, especially when people are coming together and helping to design systems that are healthier and safer for users and the producers and people that are. We can't forget the people who are producing these materials, and make sure that they're protected.
So one final question I would ask is, I think we've also just talked about this here and there about talking. What are some actionable steps, probably one or two, that individuals can take? I always try to avoid just dumping more responsibility on individuals, but what are some of the things you think we can, at least one thing, let's stick to one thing that we can do about microfiber pollution?
I think it's one that we've already talked about, is washing less.
Yes.
It'll shed fewer microfibers and prolong the life of our garments. That's another benefit.
Thank you. Well, we'll wrap up here. I can't believe we've talked for so long, but I enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much, Lisa, for coming to the podcast. It was great to have you here. It's always nice to see you.
It's such a fun conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I will post links to some of the resources that Lisa shared today. Please comment if you have any questions or any reactions to some of the things we've talked about. For example, let us know if you watch list after you've listened to this podcast. Thank you for joining. Bye. See you soon.
Thanks so much for listening to the Sustainability Nuggets podcast. I am Rarsu Maribi.
And I am Tosin Folorunsho. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating and review on wherever you listen to your podcast.
You can also show your support by signing up for a small donation to help sustain future episodes. You can find all relevant links in the description. See you in our next episode.